Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Caroline Woods, and today we're going to talk about ways companies can manage evolving risk, especially during these volatile economic times, and doing so without losing sight of long-term corporate goals. Vikas Agarwal is here with us today. He's the U.S. Risk Products and Technology Leader for PwC. Welcome, Vikas. So good to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me today.
So before we get started, we would like to hear from all of you. So be sure to ask your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And don't forget to answer that poll question as well. All right, Vikas, let's get started with really the overall landscape for businesses right now. When I think about risk, my mind immediately goes to inflation and recession. So kind of set the stage for us. According to business leaders, how big of a threat is inflation? How real is the risk of recession?
So I think as we look at it today, we would say that business leaders are cautiously optimistic. And despite a looming recession, there's still bright spots that are happening in the economy. That we've seen in our pulse surveys that we're doing with CEOs that some of the risk is down. About in January, about 69% thought that inflation and recession was an elevated risk, and that's fallen now to 62% from that standpoint. And there's still, though, an active concern about the business environment. I think what's most surprising to us is despite that active concern, 83% still are focused on growth. Everybody feels that there is still kind of an economic pie to capture out there, and they're investing to do that. And these are obviously mixed signals that we're seeing that we've never seen before as we're doing these types of surveys. But they're definitely recognizing that need for urgent growth, and we think they're zeroing in on what they can control. And there's a lot around us today that we can't control.
So let's talk about some of those things that also businesses are trying to control that may somewhat be out of their control. First up, really cybersecurity. According to that PwC survey that you mentioned, cyber attacks are the #1 business risk that leaders are concerned about. 40% of all respondents said that it's a serious risk. So how do you see that impacting the future of business, Vikas?
Absolutely. I mean, the survey told us that we're really seeing a new reality in cyber, and it's moving out from an IT issue to a broad business concern. And I think that's being driven by everything that you're seeing, what you talked about with rates, what you talked about with recession, but it's also what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. And all of these things, when we think about cyber, it's driving both the attacks that are happening from nations, and it's also in the world of fraud. And how fraud is increasing and what's happening on the dark web and other areas. Separate from our insights, our global digital trust survey found that 70% of respondents observed improvements in cybersecurity in the past year, but fewer than 40% of senior executives say they fully mitigated those risks, and even fewer think they've made the bold moves that their organizations need to move in that standpoint. And I think the importance of cyber right now, there's two things that we're seeing is one, people are going more digital. And as they rely on data and analytics and machine learning and AI, they're moving to the cloud and mobile. And that causes more threats to happen in their ecosystem. And second, just those threats themselves are just increasing in the world that we live in today.
So what advice do you have for companies looking to strengthen their cyber strategy?
I think as we look at it, people need to look at the end-to-end ecosystem of what they're doing around cyber. And whether it's how they assess risk and thinking about, do they really have a handle on their risks? Are they scenario playing when different risks happen to them from a cyber perspective, how they're going to react and what their posture is going to be? Then second is whether they have the right defense and the right intelligence. Are they putting in tools that use machine learning, that use AI to help them be more proactive rather than reactive? And then third, I think it's upskilling their professionals. I think, we really focus on that with some of the products that we have, specifically a ProEdge product, where just upskilling and making sure that IQ in terms of understanding cyber is so important today.
In terms of what else is creating uncertainty or posing risk, some other interesting survey results that I saw, nearly 2/3 of businesses, or 63%, have changed or are planning to change processes to address labor shortages. So as businesses pivot kind of towards automation, how should they consider their hiring practices? What kind of, I guess, talent is the right kind?
I think we're continuing to see it like a kind of a lopsided demand for talent. On one end, 50% of respondents said they did highlight they're looking to reduce their overall headcount. On the other hand, we are still seeing quite a bit of demand for the right specialized talent in areas like cyber, digital, cloud, machine learning, AI, and those roles continue to have power in the front office and in the back office. And I do think that is creating also even more demand where businesses need those skill sets to grow their revenue, but businesses also need those skill sets to control their risk. And we see whether it's chief risk officers, as CISOs, as CHROs, they're breaking old molds for the type of people that they're searching for. They're starting to search for best athletes of people that maybe are statisticians, that are more in mathematics, that they can cross-train in different areas that can give them the competitive edge to develop algorithms and more sophisticated ways of doing detection and assessing these risks.
So it's interesting, the needing to add because of a labor shortage, but also streamlining at the same time really plays into that kind of mixed signals theme that you were talking about. But Absolutely. It's not just hiring talent, it's also retaining talent. And you talked about upskilling already, but what should companies be doing to retain talent?
Look, I think, and we believe this at PwC, it's about you have to treat your employees like customers today. And employees are still driving, the ones with those inset skill demands, they're driving a hard bargain. It's figuring out how you provide flexibility and choice to those employees, how you give them those really interesting, fascinating things to work on that they exist. And it's figuring out how to inspire those people that are really going to drive your risk agenda forward. I think we do that a lot today in the front office, but I think the back office is making that paradigm shift just given the importance of controlling risk.
So just a reminder to our audience that we want to hear from you. So be sure to type your questions into the chat so that we can get those answered as well. But you've already given some advice and strategy, Vikas, but just from a broader level perspective when it comes to managing risk in terms of what else leaders need to do, what types of risk solutions are you seeing business leaders kind of gravitate towards?
Look, I think we find it in several categories, and technology is playing that important role. And it's all about being more digital versus manual. Oftentimes when people looked at a risk problem over the last decade, they threw a lot of bodies at it. And they threw bodies to look at information, to look at alerts of various types, whether those were cyber alerts or they were financial crime alerts or they were alerts driven by Sarbanes-Oxley's processes. And I think today people are looking at technology in different categories to really look at that in a more intelligent way. So that might be taking a business process that's manual and putting digital workflow around it. That might be taking and harnessing more data. That might be external data that they're able to scrape off the web, that they're able to get from third-party sources, that they're even able to mine from the dark web, combine that with their own data, apply machine learning to that, and get more intelligent, actionable information so that they can get ahead of threats that are coming to their company. And I think lastly, and it's this movement towards AI, and it's that item where you can go from machine learning, which is a little bit more basic of maybe there's 1,000 features or 1,200 features that are driving a decision to 5,000 plus features that are starting to mimic human decision making. And we really see the most advanced companies driving their agenda there.
I do see that we have some people who have answered the poll question. It's kind of evenly divided here in terms of how much they've used risk consulting tools or new technologies. I'm just taking a look. It's basically all over the board in terms of the responses, in terms of people who have used it or haven't even thought about it. But can you be a bit more specific about what these tools, these risk consulting tools would actually entail?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think they really, at the core, they're about going from reactive to proactive. So, for example, if you can take a large amount of information off the dark web and start using that to figure out cyber threats, can you get ahead of a ransomware event versus being able to react to that ransomware event? And now that involves taking data of what might be happening in your own firewall, data that might be happening on your employees and attrition, that might be looking at then what's coming from your external threats, and putting that information all together in a way that you probably haven't in the past. And that involves usually using leading cloud technologies, applying newer technologies to do analytics, and that allows you to kind of leapfrog from that standpoint.
In terms of where companies are investing when it comes to risk management, obviously it seems like there's a big push towards the technology component and people, but are there any areas where they're scaling back?
I think it's scaling back is in those manual processes. I think people are realizing that there's processes that they do, false positives that they look at that are providing no value to the business whatsoever. And that's where I think the scale back's happening. And I think you even see that happening with maybe some of the layoffs and where people are looking to reduce headcount is they realize the problem and the competitive advantage is not going to be born from throwing bodies at it. It's going to be born from that investment into technology.
We have a question from Carmen here. What risks will get more sophisticated in 2023, and what can companies do to get ahead of those threats?
Sure. I think it comes back to even our number one risk. I think it's cyber. I think we are seeing the cyber landscape. And when I think of cyber, I think about it as not only the cyber attacks, but also fraudsters and the number of things we're seeing around account takeovers, around synthetic IDs, and around how people are attacking companies. And it used to be just banks, and it's moving from banks to the tech companies to consumer markets, where they're doing anything they can to steal consumer information. And if they can use that consumer information to break through your firewall, whether it's to mimic an employee or whether it's to mimic a customer and use that to gain data at mass scale, that's where, and then that data becomes fodder for ransomware, it becomes fodder for other hacks that are happening. That's where we're really seeing a heightened amount of risk happening in the environment. Pivoting to what people can do about it, I think it's preparing and investing in the technologies that can allow you to detect that better. And that is a significant capital investment. But we truly believe companies that get this right, they're able to grow faster because they're not worried about the risk that they have, because they know that in their customer base or in what's happening around them, they're able to separate good from bad from gray much more easily. And that allows them to focus on growth, whether it's domestic or global growth, and even operate in higher risk geographies where their competitors can.
Vikas, Eric has a question about privacy. He says, privacy as a service is something that we are starting to see become more prevalent. As an example, his credit card now allows him to opt into a service to remove his information from public databases. He's curious about what your thoughts are on that and how it impacts businesses moving forward.
Absolutely. I think privacy is one of the areas we're going to see some of the most innovation around. And I think that innovation is going to come in pockets. One, it's giving consumers more choice around their data. But now as you give consumers more choice around their data, it does reduce our ability to control certain events, to inform them about what may be happening to their information, or inform them to be able to connect the dots where somebody might be stealing your identity or somebody might be doing something. So there's trade-offs that are happening. On the other side of it, I think what we're really excited is about how technology is solving the privacy dilemma, where there's a lot more technology out there that's in this realm of confidential computing that can use information without exposing information and provide the right risk signals to do that. And I think that's where we're really seeing the industry headed when it comes towards detection, and also a lot of the major cloud providers investing there. So figuring out how to make that trade-off less.
And Lauren is chiming in. What's the roadmap to getting executive buy-in for new risk tools, Vikas?
I think it's understanding that risk isn't just a cost, but understanding what can risk do to drive your business growth. And I think that's often missed when people put an agenda together or a business case together to look at new risk tools. They just look at it as a way that's maybe going to take a manual process and automate it more. Or they take a look, or they're comparing it to events that may be happening at their peers and thinking about that to say, hey, we don't want this to happen to us. But I think pivoting that conversation back to what we were talking about, that if you can be a company that controls your risk better than your competitors, you have an advantage in the marketplace. And when CEOs are focused on growth, and you're focused on growth through digital transformation and getting to more channels with different customers, no matter what industry you're in, being able to control that risk should allow you to grow your business. And linking those two together and making sure you're focused on those outcomes, that's how we think the most disruptive companies are going to succeed.
Vikas, Hugo has a question going back to your point about treating employees like customers at this point. He says, how does personal time off come in when treating employees as customers without an inexpensive incentive while retaining a flowing schedule?
Well, I think we always come back to it comes down to flexibility and choice, but it doesn't eliminate the need to run a high-performing workforce. We always tell our people that at PwC is that, we continue to view our employees as very high-performing and serving our clients. And, they might be working 50 to 60 hours a week, but that doesn't mean that they can't choose when they work or how they work, or they can choose over blocks of time to put in that time in different ways. And I think that's also where digital transformation is going to come in is, can you automate those processes? Can you be able to pull your workforce in the right way to give people the individual choices to allow them to do that while maximizing their performance at the times that they can give it their all?
Vikas, can you kind of build on the role of trust and transparency when it comes to managing all of these evolving risks?
Absolutely. We think trust is the number one thing today that CEOs are concerned about. And I think that trust comes in a lot of different categories, whether it's the stakeholders that they're working with in their shareholders or in the government, or it's with their public reputation at large. And trust is one of the most important topics that we see the C-suite in any company really concerned about today. And gaining trust means investing in your risk processes. Because if you're just growing without controlling that risk, that's where we see things get out of control. That's where we see ransomware attacks happen. That's where we see potentially unmitigated societal issues start to take hold. But that's where the investment in risk comes in, is saying that investment in risk is going to help us gain the trust of our stakeholders. And if we're gaining the trust of our stakeholders, we can ultimately grow faster.
Because for me, one of the key takeaways is really, despite the fact that there are so many risks that need to be managed, whether it be cybersecurity, talent retention, acquisition, the inflationary environment, geopolitics, societal unrest, it's interesting to me that companies are still doubling down on growth, and business leaders are actually optimistic, because we're hearing more and more calls for recession because of Fed interest rate hikes to combat rising inflation, but it actually seems kind of upbeat right now.
It is. And what we think is most exciting is, and I think the pandemic accelerated this, is just that need to turn companies that were more brick and mortar into digital companies. And I think people are realizing that if they do that, there's not only an advantage nationally, but an advantage globally. And I think they look at that from the front office side, but they also look at that on the back office side where, if you're looking at your data and your intelligence to measure your cyber risk, you can also look at your third-party relationships. You can look at supply chain, which becomes a very important component to a lot of businesses to running responsibly. And you can look at your controls around that digital transformation. But those are the things that we still believe are going to give companies the competitive advantage going forward.
So because we only have about 2 minutes left, so I want to give you the final word to really kind of drive home any key points, anything that we didn't discuss that you think is really important for our audience to walk away with, or what's the most important thing for them to keep in mind when it comes to managing risk?
I think there's a few things. I think it's not settling for what already works in your organization. They got to be looking for ways to disrupt the status quo. The status quo isn't good enough anymore, and that disruption is going to come through technology. I think second is C-suite collaboration. When you think about that topic of cyber moving from IT to a business standpoint, the C-suite has to be involved, whether that's tabletop exercises and how you do things, or it's collaborating with the board and being able to run scenario analysis on different risks that are happening. That's become more important than ever. And then I think lastly is the use of technology. I mean, we are seeing technology used in our risk product suite more than ever. Companies are approaching us to, again, think about ways that you use more software as a service type applications to control risk, whether they're cyber risks, whether they're financial crime risks, whether they're ERP risks, or whether they're sector-specific risks in healthcare or financial services, consumer markets, and the tech companies. But being able to apply digitized workflow, machine learning, AI, and use products in the risk space to essentially innovate and become more proactive, I think that's going to give companies the biggest advantage going forward.
Well, thank you so much for all of your strategies and advice, and really shedding some light on how people can turn some of this risk into opportunity.